Hello, hello, hello. Hello, hello. How's it doing that? Hello, hello, hello. Hello, hello. Hello, 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 hello, hello. Let's try this again. Hello, hello, hello. Try it one more time. Hello, hello, hello. Okay, that's better. Oops. Hello, everyone. Can you hear me? I just got a new microphone, so I'm trying it out. Thank you for alerting me last week that I needed one. So
it sounds a lot better.
Well, that's good. Thank you, Lila. And wouldn't have known had you not. My other class didn't say a word. They were happy just, seeing me as a mime. Anyway, good. Any questions about anything? Okay, let us see. I know there were some important announcements that I had. The history department tonight is having an event with Nat Scheidley, who is the director of Revolutionary Spaces. It is on Zoom, so he's an interesting guy. It happens to be at the same time I'm speaking to the Worcester Historical Society about John Hancock. So I'm not, you can attend either. And either one will be interesting, beneficial to you in your lives as citizens and as historians. So there you have it. So other questions, announcements? About half of you have submitted your papers. The rest are, I guess, waiting for midnight. And then I can respect that you wait until the very last minute to get things in, or you completely forgot that something was due. And a number of you got them in early, which is great. And so let us see, where are we? What were we talking about last time?
We left off with December 22nd when Washington reached the State House in Maryland.
Okay. And nothing happened after that?
December 23rd, he meets with Congress and 19 others. They remove their hats for him before retiring from service.
Okay. It sounds like we've been going through the revolution day by day, just the way you're telling it. Anyone else have that's great, Lila. Thank you. Anyone else have any?
I can remember you described the what was it? Well, not quite mutiny, but the efforts to maybe pressure Congress through military force, and how Washington de-escalated that.
Right, there was a coup d'etat attempt by some of his officers, possibly. This is good. Other things anyone remembers that stand out? Things if someone said to you, what do you know about the American Revolution? You would be able to immediately say, well, this is something that happened that you learned last week. I know that's narrowing it down. By the way, I'm not going to criticize you if you get something wrong or if it's not what I had in mind, because I really want to know where you are so that then we can move on. Okay, that pretty much says it all. Good, that's good. Okay, so the big problem for the United States after the war ends and after Washington goes home is, by the way, does anyone know what the big problem is? I shouldn't be the one. Well, actually, no, according to the dean, I am the one who should be telling you these things.
I don't know if this is what you're getting at, but paying.
Exactly, yes. How are you going to pay the soldiers and the various people or nations or banks which loaned money to the United States or to the states. I mean, this is the reason the officers were mutinying. It's the reason the soldiers from Pennsylvania surrounded the State House in Philadelphia, is they knew the country was broke, that there was no money, and that if they didn't take action now, nothing would happen. And I'll tell you what does happen is that Congress and the states promise that they are going to pay off the officers and the soldiers. And of course, that's a good thing. The Congress debates, okay, should we give the officers full pay for 10 years or half pay for life? And by the way, wars are extraordinarily expensive things. And this one was expensive, no less than any other. And one of the big expenses, of course, is paying all of the people who are serving. And here you have this army. You also have state militias. And states had found different ways of trying to pay the soldiers, trying to encourage them to enlist. But ultimately, they all come down essentially to paper money or an IOU. So the state of, let's see, Virginia, or we'll use Massachusetts as an example. It says, okay, thank you for your service. And here is 100 pounds. I know you can't really see it. It's a piece of paper, but it's not really 100 pounds. What it is a promise that in 10 years, this will be worth 100 pounds. By the way, states and municipalities in the United States still use this as a way of borrowing money. It's called a bond. That is, we have agreed, this is our bond, a promise, a binding agreement that in 10 years, this will be worth 100 pounds. And then 100 pounds in gold, and then you can come and collect it. I should point out that at this time, well, there essentially are two different kinds of metal that are used as currency. Well, there are three if you count copper. And I know some of you are better economists than I am. What are the two metals principally used as currency?
Gold and silver.
Gold and silver, thank you. Okay. Now, James got one, so I'll leave the next question to someone else. Where did gold and silver come from? There's actually a very simple answer, and then there is a more complicated answer I will be looking for after you give me the simple answer, which is under the ground. That is, they're mined, they're dug up. And principal source of silver in the world, well, actually, the Spanish coined both gold and silver. And gold circulated typically in the form of Spanish dollars, but also if you have much in the way of gold, you might also have Portuguese coins or Italian coins, because they also used gold. And those are, and France uses the livre, the L-I-V-R-E. Okay. Anyone know what the basic form of currency in Great Britain would have been at this period?
The pound?
The pound, yes. And pound is short for something. Now, I don't want James to be the only one answering, because then you'll think I planted him with the answers, and this is just a way of making him seem really, really smart. And he is, but he's not really much smarter than the rest of you. So let's see if we can figure out what pound is short for. There's another word that often goes with it. I'll just make this easy.
Pound sterling?
Excuse me, Tariq?
Pound sterling?
Pound sterling, very good. Yes, yes. And what is sterling?
Isn't it silver?
It is silver. Thank you, Jordan. Yes. So, yeah. Was that a tedious line of discussion that we were having, Jordan, and you just wanted to end it? Let's stop talking about pounds and sterling. Yeah. So Britain uses the pound, which is silver. Okay. Now, the United States at this time did not have gold or silver, which meant any gold or silver that was here had to come from somewhere else. The British are creating silver coins. The Spanish, the French, the Dutch, the Portuguese are creating gold coins. Americans are trading for both, but doesn't have a raw supply of this. So what the United States can do is print money. and states were printing money, and some state currencies were actually based on the pound. A couple had gone over to the dollar. The dollar is actually the Spanish unit or the Mexican unit. When people in this period talk about gold dollars, they're typically talking about coinage from Mexico, but although that was then still part of the Spanish Empire. So the United States doesn't have any of these things. However, the states have gotten heavily into debt by promising to pay soldiers or others who had loaned money to the United States or to the state a considerable amount within 10 years. So where are these states going to get this money? That's one big question. And in fact, this debt is the biggest thing on the state's budget deficit. So for example, 1785, Massachusetts had a total debt of about 1.4 million pounds. That might not seem like a lot to you folks who think about pounds. Today, does anyone know what let me put it this way. If you wanted to find out how much is 1.4 million pounds worth today, what would you do? Have we covered this? Dylan, you have a thought on converting pounds in 1785 to pounds today? Your light just went on. I guess not. Okay. Yes, Tariq.
Would you look at inflation rate since the time and purchasing power?
Exactly. Now, Tariq sounds like he knows how to do this. For the rest of us who don't, I am going to show you something which I think will be.
Did you say 1.6 pound?
1.6 million pounds.
Okay, I may have looked it up.
Where did you look it up?
On Google.
Okay. Google's usually not the best source for this. And by the way, people who work for Google say, you use the correct phrase, I looked it up on Google. They don't like it when you say, I Googled it, because that takes away Google's proprietary interest in the word, in their own name. Okay, so this is a measuring site called, a website called Measuring Worth, put together by economists. And it is a really easy way to figure out what are relative values. So here, our year is 1785. And the figure we had was, actually it's 1,468,554 pounds. And we're going to see how much is that roughly today. Now, these are very careful economists. So they won't do today, you have to go to last year. And then you hit calculate. And this tells us a number of different values that could have. You know, Tariq was onto this because there is the value of 1.4 million pounds as a commodity. There are 4 different choices: the real price, the labor value, the income value, the economic share, or that as a measure of income or wealth. And here you have the real wage or real wealth value, or if you want to compare that to a project. So it costs so much to build this building. What would that be today? So here we see, I think probably income or wealth is going to be the best measure of this, because that's something we all can picture. And it says the real wage or real wealth value of 1.468 million pounds is 187 million pounds. Okay, this is a simple way to do this, to figure out how much something was worth in comparing it. So that's an interesting lesson for today, how we figure this out. So Massachusetts, this total debt of 1.4 million pounds or 187 million pounds. I don't know, someone may know what Massachusetts's total debt is today and can tell us how this compares. Of course, we have a much bigger population. Now, when you borrow money, you don't borrow, say, 187 million pounds, and then in 10 years go and pay back 187 million pounds, because the people who loan money out actually make money by charging interest. So every year, and that's one promise, the state has loaned you something, or you have loaned the state something on the promise that every year the state is going to pay something back to you in the form of interest. If you do borrow money, by the way, most of what you pay back is going to be in the form of interest. If you say, borrow money to go to college, hypothetically speaking, or borrow money to buy a house, you're actually paying probably about half of the return in interest. So in this case, every year Massachusetts has to pay £88,000 in interest to the people who have loaned money to Massachusetts. And that comes to about £10 million today. So that's pretty hefty. And every year, Massachusetts, well, what Massachusetts decides to do is this. There are a number of things Massachusetts decides to do in this period. One choice you have, and this is something that makes it a little interesting. So let's suppose that, James, you are the soldier, you have this certificate worth £100 in 10 years. You go home, you need to pay taxes, and I'll get to what taxes Massachusetts charge in a minute. You also may need to buy stuff. Let's suppose you're a farmer, you need to buy seed and other things, and you might have a mortgage on your property. So here you have a piece of paper that in 10 years is going to be worth £100. Now, on the other hand, let's say, Yanis, you are someone who has gold. You've been shrewd and you've managed to hold on to your gold. And you know that James has a certificate that in 10 years might be worth £100. What's it worth right now? James, can you use this to pay your taxes?
No, I mean, I imagine I could use it as collateral for something, but
you could use it as collateral for something. But right now, you have to come up with at least £1 in gold or silver every year, just to pay the poll tax in Massachusetts. The tax Massachusetts charges to every person over the age of 16. So if there's more than one person over the age of 16 in your household, you've got to come up with more than £1. And a pound would be worth about 127 pounds today, £1 in 1785. You also may have other debts. And right now, all you have is this piece of paper that in 10 years, and things, I have to tell you, things don't really look good for Massachusetts being able to pay this off. What if they decide, hey, you know, we have too much debt. Why don't we just write it off and say, too bad for those of you we gave these pieces of paper to. But I have good news for you. Holding on to this piece of paper while your family is starving, the sheriff is coming to foreclose on your property because you haven't paid your mortgage or you haven't paid your property taxes on it, which is another serious thing. Do you know what happens if you don't pay your property taxes? I don't know if anyone's been in this situation. A nice guy from the State Department of Revenue comes and says, we know you're going through a hard time and you're really trying to work things out, so we won't make you pay it. That's, I suppose, one option, which I don't think has ever happened. Dylan, are you going to venture what happens if you don't pay your property taxes? I think Dylan is not.
Did you just get evicted? I don't know if this is like a trick
Yeah,
question.
you just get evicted. Yeah, you would get evicted. Your property would be seized and sold to someone else, usually at auction. Okay, so we'll auction off your property to someone else, so you lose it. Okay, so this is what James is facing: losing his property because he can't pay the taxes or because he can't pay the mortgage, in which case the bank would seize it, or whoever loaned. There isn't really a bank at this time. And here he does have this piece of paper. Now, the good news I was getting to is Yanis has gold, and Yanis sees a possible investment here. He knows that there are lots of guys like James who have these certificates that are worthless, and what he can do is actually give these guys cash, that is gold or silver, in exchange for these. Now, he's not going to give them £100 because right now this isn't worth £100. I'm really not sure what it's worth. And how would you determine what the worth of this is today? See, these are kind of the basic economic principles. Excuse me?
Could you repeat the question?
How would you determine what the worth of something like this certificate is today?
It depends on the interest on the certificate.
Okay, it depends on the interest of on the certificate. And so you may get an interest payment every year. Let's suppose it's a 5% interest. So then if it's £100, what is the interest payment you're going to be getting? Although these don't bear interest. This is just 10 years, you're going to get £100 for this. I like the way you're thinking though, Tariq.
Would it be if people accept it?
Exactly, Jake. That's exactly it. What is this worth? What is someone willing to pay for this? And what is someone willing to sell this for? So in this case, James knows what he owes, what he needs right now. Yanis knows how much he may be willing to give. Let's suppose, James, your total indebtedness this year is £10. And if you don't get £10, you're going to be out on the street. Would you take £10 for this?
It depends how close I am to that 10-year mark, but yeah, I mean, if you're out on the street, I mean.
Okay, yeah. So Yanis is buying these up, and Yanis is making a real gamble here. Maybe in 10 years, Massachusetts won't be able to pay any of this. In that case, he's only out £10 for each one. On the other hand, if Massachusetts is able to make good on this, then, of course, he's made 90%. So this is something happening here. There are a lot more folks like James than there are people like Yanis, which is one reason there's such a big debt. That is, there are folks who are able to buy up some of these certificates and save James from being cast out on the street, which no one wants to see happen, including Yanis. I mean, he's the one who's willing to gamble that this certificate is going to be worth something. Now, Massachusetts, we'll get back to Massachusetts here rather than all of these hypothetical. Massachusetts's state budget primarily came from property taxes. Every year, Massachusetts collected something like 1.9 million pounds in direct taxes. Much of this in this poll tax I mentioned that everyone has to pay. Massachusetts's tax rate is something like 4 times the rate of other states in 1785. And the poll tax accounts for about 30 to 40% of state revenues. Now, what happens is, in Massachusetts, we're taxing people really heavily. And people complain. They're having trouble paying their taxes. The war has just ended. And people like James have come home and suddenly they're hit with this big tax bill. And you've been off serving your country. And so Massachusetts in 1784 says, what we're going to do is this. We're going to give people a break. We're going to not have the poll tax this year as a way of letting people off the hook this year. So this is what happens. Tax break for everyone in 1784. Everyone is happy. Although people like Yanis are a little worried. What happens if they keep up this, hey, let's everyone just do what they want and not pay their taxes? In 10 years, they won't be able to pay us back. We really want to make sure that the state is fiscally solvent. And in Massachusetts, as you're probably aware, as I think I tried to explain last time, the state government has a balance with the state legislature representing the interests of the common folks, people like James. I'm sorry, the state House of Representatives represents James, the common folk. The state Senate represents wealthier people like Yanis, the folks who are able to pay their taxes. The state Senate is apportioned by how much in tax revenues each county generates. And to be a member of the state Senate, you have to have an annual income worth £600. To be a member of the state House, you only have to have an annual income of about £100. So you have to be 6 times wealthier to be in the state Senate than to be in the state House of Representatives. So what happens in 1785, because there is this balance in the state government, and also there are elections every year, and people like Yanni say, if we want to get paid back, we really better make sure the right people who want to pay us back get elected to the state legislature. New state legislature comes in and they decide, hey, you know what? We're going to double taxes this year to make up for the shortfall from last year. What happens if we don't collect any taxes? There's a big budget deficit, and that could be a bad thing. So the legislature doubles the taxes, And what happens then, particularly, as I think I mentioned, Suffolk County, Essex County have between them almost half of the state Senate. Counties like Hampden and Berkshire don't have so many state senators. People in those counties think we're being railroaded by Salem and Boston, by these wealthy merchants who sit around drinking tea. They charge them with having tea drinking orgies in Boston and Cambridge and Salem, which may very well be true, and jacking up the tax rates and really hurting us. And now because we can't pay our taxes, our properties are being foreclosed upon. And property foreclosures typically happen in the courts. And the courts in Massachusetts are really busy hearing suits for debt, as well as suits for non-payment of taxes. So people who owe Yannis money, he is now going after them in court to try to take their property, which is his right. And what happens in Western Massachusetts is people go down to the court and stop the courts from meeting. They shut down the court sessions because they see the courts as operating to take their property away. In fact, in the winter of 1786-87, an armed rebellion breaks out in Western Massachusetts, shutting down the state courts because they're hearing all of these suits for debt. And there's real anger in Western Massachusetts about a distant state government, which isn't really protecting us, but instead is simply trying to get money out of us to pay off people like Yannis and other speculators who have seized this opportunity. By the way, had there been any other tax revolts in Massachusetts that you can remember previous to this? People angry about high taxes and taking up arms against them? Jordan, do you have any thoughts on previous tax revolts in Massachusetts?
Yeah, I think there were a couple in response to, well, I mean, there were a few. The first one was the Sugar or the Stamp Act first. They have revolted against all of them.
Yeah, they were both against taxes, exactly. This is what they've been doing, for 30 years ago, 20 years ago. This is only 20 years after the stamp tax. And I should tell you, though, one of the leaders in 1764, 1765 against those taxes, Samuel Adams. Can anyone predict what Samuel Adams is going to say about these farmers in Western Massachusetts shutting down the courts because they don't like to pay taxes, which they think are imposed by a distant, oppressive government?
My guess is that now that he is the government, he's going to say that they need to pay them.
You would be very right. But it's not just, hey, now I'm in power, and he's not really in power. He is a member of the state Senate. In fact, he's president of the state Senate at this time. He says, we were rebelling against a government in which we had no voice. We do elect this government. You really cannot rebel against a government that you elect. And he is as I said, president of the state Senate, which in Massachusetts is a very important office. The governor is James Bowdoin, who is one of the authors of the Massachusetts Constitution. And Bowdoin winds up sending troops out to Western Massachusetts to put down this rebellion, which is mainly led by guys who are veterans of the Massachusetts State Militia. And they see this much differently. These aren't the embattled farmers at Concord Bridge. These are people trying to overthrow an elected government. And how can you overthrow an elected government? Because it's elected. This is the people's government. It's not the British government. So Samuel Adams says this is much different. And by the way, there also are similar things happening in New Hampshire, Pennsylvania, Maryland, Virginia, the blocking of debt collection. And Massachusetts faces this real threat, a seeming threat. It is actually put down with troops. That is, Benjamin Lincoln goes out to Western Massachusetts, leading Massachusetts troops, and they do manage to put down the rebellion before the rebels are trying to seize the armory at Springfield to arm themselves. This is in January and February of 1787. And long, interesting story about this, but you can see this real problem here. What happens then? The rebellion dies down. Most of the rebels actually flee over the border into New York or to Vermont to get out of Massachusetts, which is probably what they should have done in the first place, because there really isn't a future here. But the state government says this is really a serious problem, having this big debt and having people taking up arms against the state government. I should tell you that what happens in the spring elections in 1787 is this. It's actually the most lopsided election in the history of Massachusetts. The legislature that had doubled taxes was turned out almost completely. And instead of James Bowdoin, the governor who's trying to get tough with the rebels, he is replaced with John Hancock, whose main goal in life is to be well liked by people. And one way you are well liked is by trying to cut their taxes and pardoning them if they do something like this. So Hancock, the conciliator, comes in, but it seems like Massachusetts has this real problem here because we have these soldiers who are in debt. We can't pay them. They can't pay their taxes. It becomes a vicious cycle. Now, Rhode Island has a very democratic state government. And Rhode Island recognizes that most people are debtors. They are the ones who elect us, the state legislature. So what we'll do is make things easy for them. So let us suppose there's a similar case to Yannis loaning James, loaning James 10 pounds in gold or giving him 10 pounds in gold in exchange for a certificate. Let's suppose in this case, Jake Roach, you are the creditor. That means you have loaned money to people. And let's suppose you've loaned money to Lila and you loaned her 100 pounds in gold. Now, Lila, do you have 100 pounds in gold to pay him back?
No.
I'm guessing that's a no.
No.
Well, here is the good news in Rhode Island. You can pay him back in something that is worth the same. So James, you loaned her 100 pounds in gold, and she has 100 pounds of corn, or what she says is 100 pounds worth of corn. Would you be interested in that?
Well, then we're sort of getting into barter here. I don't know if, I mean, it's kind of nice to have the cold hard cash.
Well, yeah, you see, gold is something that you can actually, anyone is going to see the value in 100 pounds worth of gold. 100 pounds, that is pounds sterling. I'm sorry for using that when I was saying sterling was silver. But a wheelbarrow filled with corn or a wagon load of corn that Lila has, you're going to have to find someone else who is interested in that. And let me see a show of hands. Who here would not be interested in 100 pounds worth of corn? You're not in. Okay, Jordan's saying no, she's not. James says he is not. The good news in Rhode Island is this. The legislature says if someone is in debt, like Lila, and she makes a good faith offer to pay the debt back, and the creditor refuses, which James has just done, and we all heard him say he wouldn't accept 100 pounds worth of corn, the debt's canceled. So there are apocryphal stories of debtors like Lila chasing their creditors to the Massachusetts border, pushing a wheelbarrow filled with something, trying to get them to refuse it. Because once you refuse it, the debt's over. So Rhode Island is really a good place if you're in debt. Not a really good place if you are in business. So this is what's happening in Rhode Island. And then we get to Virginia. And Virginia is much more, Virginia, by the way, has 4 times the debt of Massachusetts. Virginia's 1784 debt is something over 4 million pounds. Its annual interest payment, 207,000 pounds. And that's about 542 million pounds today. So that would be about $700 million today that Virginia has to pay back to its debtors. And what Virginia does, by the way, Virginia's war debt is the second largest of any state. I believe the first largest was probably North Carolina, but I could be wrong. That would be a good question on a test, particularly a question I don't know the answer to. So What Virginia does is this. First, it has different zones and land is taxed differently. The most heavily taxed land in Virginia is along the Tidewater. The most lightly taxed land is in Kentucky on the other side of the mountains. By the way, what is going to happen if land is really taxed really heavily in one place, less heavily in another place, just as a general rule? If taxes are higher in one place than another, what is likely to happen?
People will move to the place that has lower taxes.
People will move to the place that has lower taxes, yes. And neither James nor I is, well, I don't know, maybe we are libertarian cranks who are advancing this idea. But yeah, that is something that happens. Now, that's going to encourage people to leave the highly taxed area to go to the less taxed area. But that's something Virginia wants to happen. Another thing Virginia wants to happen is to retire this debt. And much of the debt in Virginia is in the form of these certificates, these 100-pound bonds that we gave out to the soldiers. So what we say is, you know what? You actually can pay your taxes in these. You can't do that in Massachusetts. So now, if James were in Virginia and he had one of these certificates, he could actually use it to pay his taxes, which is good for Virginia because, you know, they know this isn't worth 100 pounds, but now we no longer owe 100 pounds to James because he's used this to pay his taxes. But also, Virginia is also going to tax these. This is worth 100 pounds, so you're going to have to pay a tax on it every year. So it makes sense for people who hold these certificates in Virginia to turn them into the state as a way of getting rid of them. Also, you can use these certificates to buy land in Kentucky. Now, in Virginia, the land tax brings in every year about 128,000 pounds. The tax on these certificates brings in 127,000 pounds. So about half of the state's tax revenue comes from the tax on these certificates. And this is another thing that's going to encourage people who have invested in them. Like Yannis had been stockpiling these. Now he has a pile of these that are being taxed. He is going to use these to pay his taxes. Let's not hold these anymore. And that's the end of it. So speculators are encouraged to give these up. And also the tax differential between the Tidewater and Kentucky is encouraging people to move to Kentucky. In 1779, there were about 179 white people in Kentucky. By 1785, there are 30,000. By 1790, 73,000. We really see a movement to the west, which is really being encouraged by this tax policy. There's a similar movement into Tennessee and into Vermont. Vermont is really a different story because it's not a state. It's claimed by both New York and New Hampshire at this time, and that's a subject for another day. But what happens here is that Virginia has a high debt, but it uses its tax policy to pay off its debt and also to encourage the settlement in the West, which is going to bring in more tax revenues to the state. Now, Virginia's example really shows that it is possible to do something here to get out of debt. The problem Massachusetts had is Massachusetts did not have a Kentucky that it could use to settle. You could use to get the debtors out of Massachusetts to another place. Massachusetts had actually at this time, the fastest growing part of Massachusetts was Maine. People are flooding into Maine, but that's not land the state can give away. New York does something similar with land it had taken from the Iroquois. The Iroquois, who had owned much of New York before the war, during the war, General Sullivan had invaded the Onondaga country and destroys much of it. And then that land is given to soldiers from New York as a payment for having served. So the tax revolt in Massachusetts is kind of a big warning to others about what could happen if we don't get a handle on the debt. Another big warning is the fact that the United States doesn't have any money to pay its debts. So in 1785, the United States actually failed to make its payment on the loan the French had given to the United States because there's no money in the federal treasury. Over these years, Congress could requisition money from the states. And over the years between 1781 and 1787, Congress requisitioned something like $17 million, and the states had sent in a little over $1 million. There's a requisition, it's a request. We tell the state, this is how much you should send in. And the states say, well, okay, what if we don't? By the way, what could Congress do to get the states to send in the money that the states were supposed to send in to Congress? Any ideas what the states can do? Or what the Congress can do if states are not fulfilling their obligations? What power does Congress have over the states? Tariq, you have a thought?
To what extent? What do you mean not following?
Okay, so Congress had told each state, this is how much you have to send in every year. The states had not done that. What can Congress do to get the states to pay?
Can they cut off federal support?
Well, see, the federal government doesn't have anything to support them with. So there's really no federal support to speak of. Because the states are the ones that are providing Congress with their only source of revenue.
Could be like a fine or something like that.
It could make a fine. The states had not paid their requisition. Why are they going to pay a fine?
I'm sort of curious here. Did the federal government at this time, did they have the power to control like import taxes or anything like that, or?
No. In fact, that's another big, actually in 1781 and again in 1783, some members of Congress had proposed letting Congress have a 1% or a 5% cut of the tariffs that states charged. And in order to do that, every state would need to agree. Rhode Island would not go along with this. New York would not go along with this. So Congress does not have any other source of revenue. It has two sources of revenue. One is borrowing money, and the other is requisitioning money. By the way, there is actually today a body very much like this that operates out of New York, as well as The Hague and Geneva, an international body that also gets its revenue from its members who are nation states. And if members don't pay their dues to the United Nations, what can the United Nations do? There's maybe another way of looking at it. There's one nation, excuse me? Nothing, exactly. Imagine what would happen if the United Nations decided we really want to get the money that, say, the United States owes. I know that the United States owes a lot to the United Nations, according to the United Nations. How would it go about doing that?
They ask politely.
They could ask politely, yeah. And imagine if they tried to use, say, military force, how that would go. That would be really an interesting thing to see. Interesting in the way of, I don't want to see it, and then I don't want someone tweeting that Professor Allison wishes that is daring the United States, the United Nations to try to take us on. Anyway, this is the point where I start hyperventilating. So I will calm down and talk about this more rationally. There's really nothing Congress can do, nothing the United Nations can do. And the reason, there are two reasons for this. One, it would be somewhat absurd. And imagine if the Congress in 1787 decided it was going to use military force to try to get the money that Massachusetts owed it, or that Virginia owed it. Send troops to Virginia and see how that goes. Imagine that. And there's a philosophical reason why Congress cannot do anything to get money out of the states. Does anyone know what that is? Who elected the members of Congress?
Well, the folks in the House of Representatives would have been elected by the people, right?
No, no. We're
Oh.
talking about the Continental Congress. So you're in a different system of government, James. Okay, let's put it this way. Who elected the members or the representatives to the United Nations General Assembly?
The governments of each state.
Yes, exactly. The governments of each state have sent these delegates to New York to be their representative. What relationship does the United Nations have to you as a citizen of the United States? What connection do you have?
None whatsoever.
Thank you, Tariq. None whatsoever. Right. There is no direct connection. You've had no say in who they are or what they do. Similarly, no one in the United States, other than a member of one of the state legislatures, has voted for a member of Congress. There is no representation there. So Congress, by its very nature, and this is the Continental Congress, because there's going to be a big change in 1787, 88, does not have any direct power over you as an ordinary citizen. And this is a problem for Congress because there, for some purposes, Congress does need a source of revenue. And this is one reason the states were reluctant to give Congress that, not because the states were mean-spirited and vindictive, but because the states recognized that we were elected, or the state governments, we were elected by the people of our states. Congress wasn't elected by anybody other than us. So Congress has no way of getting you, ordinary citizens, to pay anything. So that's really the big problem here, that you have this federal system that really isn't working. And some states are doing okay, like Virginia. Others aren't doing okay, like Massachusetts. They still have this big debt. And then there are others who are not doing okay. By the way, there is kind of an argument among some historians about whether things really were that bad in the 1780s to provoke the change that happens. Now, there are different people in the United States who see the way the system is not working as really a serious enough problem that something needs to be done about it. For example, if you are a merchant involved in international trade, these are not good times for you for a couple of reasons. One, we won the war. The British recognized American independence, but the British also said, you're no longer welcome to trade in Jamaica or Barbados or Canada or other places where, when we were all part of one big happy empire, you could. So go someplace else to sell your codfish or to buy your sugar. So Americans are essentially cut out of the West Indies. The British also alert the Day of Algiers that the British flag no longer protects these ships you may see carrying this different flag. So actually in the summer of 1785, the Algerians capture a couple of American merchant ships in the Mediterranean. When the Americans selling codfish no longer could go to the West Indies, they go first to the Mediterranean, because the north shore of the Mediterranean, great market for codfish. Most people there are Catholic, and once a week, Fridays, they cannot eat meat. So they're looking for fish to eat on Fridays. So codfish, great thing to sell in the Mediterranean until the Algerians find out if they capture an American ship, they can hold it for ransom. Now, Algiers had an arrangement with the British that they would not attack British ships because every year Britain paid Algiers £1 million to attack ships of other rival countries. The French paid Algiers 1 million livres every year to leave the French ships alone and instead attack other ships. So Algiers actually did this, capturing merchant ships from other countries as a way of getting that country either to pay an annual tribute or to get the families of the sailors and the owners of the ships to pay a ransom. So if you're going into the Mediterranean, you're going to have to pay either pay ransom to Algiers or pay a really hefty insurance. Some merchants, by the way, say, okay, the Mediterranean's pretty much closed off, and the West Indies are pretty much closed off. So a group of merchants in New York and Boston pool their resources and send a couple of ships to China. This is really a big, risky venture for them, but it pays off magnificently. They open up a trade with China, but that's not something everyone can do. However, other merchants say, you know, we have this big problem. We can't trade in the West Indies or in the Mediterranean, which had been our two biggest trading places. So we need a government that can protect our ships on the high seas. There's also, let me see how to put this, other folks who are interested in a government that can do something for them. Here's another thing. You'll recall that the Spanish and the French had wanted the American boundary to be not the Mississippi River. Now, Spain says, hey, you know what? We control the western side of the Mississippi River. You can't use the Mississippi River because we control half of it. So Spain wants to close off the Mississippi River to American trade. John Jay, who is the American Minister for Foreign Affairs, negotiates a treaty with the Spanish, and he says, okay, we'll give up the Mississippi River, but we'll be able to trade in Spain. What do you think of that? Good bargain? Well, we won't use the Mississippi River, but Spain will let us bring codfish to Spain?
What's the significance of the Mississippi River other than transportation?
What's the significance of the Mississippi? Well, transportation is a big one. And that is, if you're one of these guys who's going out to Kentucky, let's suppose, the Mississippi River is your one way of getting any of your goods to market. You can't get them over the mountains to the eastern side of the continent. But what you can do fairly easily is put them on a flatboat, take them down the Mississippi River to New Orleans and sell them there. And then what you do is you get cash for selling both the goods. You probably also will sell the boat, and then you'll simply walk home. This is a big place for trade for Americans in New Orleans or in the lower part of the Mississippi River. So you say, what's the significance aside from transportation? You know, transportation is a major one. I mean, that's kind of like saying, what's the significance of a highway aside from transportation? I mean, try doing without it. So that's really, it's a good question. So Spain said, we're going to close the Mississippi River, but we'll let you trade in Spain. Who's going to be happy with that arrangement? I don't necessarily mean who in this room, but yes, James, you happy with this?
I imagine any merchants who want to sell codfish are probably pretty happy.
Yeah, if you're a codfish merchant, which means some New Englanders are happy. Was there anyone who would not be happy with this?
Probably all the farmers living out by the Mississippi, which is a really good transport hub.
Yeah, or if you're thinking about moving out to the Mississippi River or anywhere that the Ohio River drains, say, well, wait a minute, you're giving away the Mississippi River in return for benefiting a group of guys selling codfish. This is not going to make you happy. Couple of other problems that the country has. As I said, Congress cannot tax imports, but states can. And states have different rules about import taxes and import duties. So for example, in the Chesapeake Bay, huge body of water between Maryland and Virginia, and each state has ports on the Chesapeake. Now, a merchant bringing in a cargo to the Chesapeake, does the merchant pay his taxes in Virginia or in Maryland? Can't really hear you, Ainsley.
You must have poor service or something.
Wherever he lands.
Wherever he lands. Okay, let's suppose that you are a revenue agent in Portsmouth, Virginia, and you see someone bringing a cargo into the Chesapeake, and you say, are you going to pay your taxes in Virginia? And the person says, well, no, actually, I'm going to Baltimore or to Chestertown, to Maryland ports. Are you going to believe that? I mean, we have no reason to doubt Tariq, let's say, is the merchant bringing in a cargo of goods and goes by Portsmouth. Typically, if you're a merchant, by the way, you're going to be going between these different places. And Virginia might not believe the claim of Tariq that he's just bringing this cargo of goods up to Chestertown in Maryland. And that's, I suppose, see, Tariq was so offended at not being believed, he cut out of the class because he's on his way to Maryland to sell a cargo of goods. What's, wherever you land, that should be, what if you're going between the places? Now, this is kind of the problem you see for determining who pays taxes where, but then there is a bigger problem, which is every time you bring a cargo into the Chesapeake, all of these people are coming out from every port saying, hey, did you pay your taxes to us? What is ultimately going to happen to people who are bringing cargoes of goods into the Chesapeake? If both Maryland and Virginia on each side of the bay have their hands out? What would you do if you were a merchant? And you have one option is to go to the Chesapeake where everyone is hitting you up to pay taxes.
I imagine you'd go to trade somewhere else where there aren't so many taxes.
You would. And another thing that happens is they change the rules every year. The legislature decides to raise the rates on some things, lower the rates on other things. So you didn't know when you brought your cargo out how much you were going to have to pay. And you have everyone in these states trying to get their hand into it. So you're going to find another place to trade. Virginia and Maryland recognize that this is really bad for business here, to have this kind of confusing system. What we really need to do is regulate this. Now, think about this philosophically. Whose job should it be to determine what the tax rates are to a merchant coming into Virginia or Maryland, or into the Chesapeake Bay, which flows between them, or for that matter, into, say, New York Harbor, which flows between two different states? You see a similar problem along the Hudson, with New Jersey and New York each claiming a share of things going by way of the Hudson River. Or if you're going up the Delaware River to Philadelphia, the other side of the river is New Jersey. And also part of the river is Delaware. So you have 3 states there, and Connecticut does border on parts of what becomes New York Harbor. So you might have tried to get in by way of Long Island Sound, and Long Island Sound is between 2 different states. You have this divided jurisdiction in a lot of different places. Albemarle Sound in North Carolina, part of it is in Virginia. And a merchant going into the Chesapeake might have stopped there first. Will he have to pay taxes on his entire cargo in 3 different states? I mean, this is going to be what's going to lead a merchant like James to say, hey, I'm not going to go there anymore. It's going to hurt trade for everybody unless someone gets a handle on this. And now ask, is there any organization that you think might be able to solve this particular set of problems? Conflicts between states over trade in waters that lie between the states. Is there any body, I'm not saying anybody, any body responsible for settling conflicts between states? Yes, Ainsley, it is Congress. Thank you. That's what Congress is supposed to do. And there is actually only one case where Congress does resolve a problem between two states. And that is the big problem between Connecticut and Pennsylvania over people who had moved out into the Wyoming Valley, the upper Susquehanna River Valley in Pennsylvania. People from Connecticut had moved there in the 1750s, set up their towns, paid their taxes to Hartford, sent representatives to the general court in Hartford, and pretty much ignored Pennsylvania. And it's not that Pennsylvania didn't like being ignored, but Pennsylvania didn't like the fact that all of this land in the upper Wyoming Valley was now in the hands of people from Connecticut when Pennsylvania could sell it to people from Pennsylvania. So this was almost on the point of war between Pennsylvania and Connecticut back in the early 1770s. The only thing that stopped it was the fact that both of them joined in this war against Great Britain. Well, now that war is over. And guess what? Neither side has forgotten. Connecticut's not forgotten that this is part of Connecticut. Pennsylvania hasn't forgotten that it claims this is part of Pennsylvania. And unlike Maryland and Virginia, which we'll get back to in a minute, Pennsylvania and Connecticut go to Congress to get this resolved. And Congress, anyone know what Congress decides? What would you decide if you were Congress? Is this part of Connecticut or is it part of Pennsylvania? Yes, and Ainsley, again, despite her faulty connection, has come on with the right answer that Congress sides with Pennsylvania. And Pennsylvania immediately, the ruling comes down in January. Pennsylvania immediately sends the militia up to the Wyoming Valley to clear these people off of this land that they've been on for 20, 30 years. So Congress is able to solve that problem to the satisfaction of Pennsylvania, not necessarily to the satisfaction of Connecticut or anyone with a shred of human decency. So there you have Connecticut losing out. Meanwhile,
come across the atrocious aftermath.
What, Dylan? I don't know if Dylan was part of this conversation or another one. What happens between Maryland and Virginia is this. In March of 1785, each state sends commissioners to try to resolve this problem of the navigation of the Chesapeake Bay, because they realize both of us are getting hurt by the fact that each one claims its control over the Chesapeake. And the commissioners meet at Mount Vernon. There's actually a small town near George Washington's estate where the commissioners from the two states get together and they discuss this big problem of navigating the Chesapeake Bay and the Potomac River. And Mount Vernon is on the Potomac River. And they also know that Pennsylvania also has an interest in the Potomac because Virginia at this time is trying to dig a canal from the Potomac River to the Ohio River. And Pennsylvania, of course, borders on the Ohio River. So they say, you know what? This isn't just a problem between Virginia and Maryland. It's a problem that also involves Pennsylvania. Plus, some trade into Pennsylvania also goes by way of the Chesapeake Bay. Because if you go north enough on the Chesapeake Bay, you come to the Elk Creek, and that's what the route the British had used to invade Philadelphia back in 1777. So they realized Pennsylvania should be part of this discussion too. And if we're talking about Pennsylvania, most of Pennsylvania's trade goes by way of the Delaware River, and that would involve New Jersey. And if you're involving New Jersey and Philadelphia, Pennsylvania, you also should involve Delaware. You know, periodically someone brings up Delaware and thinks they should be considered. And this is one of those instances. So for those of you who are real fans of Delaware, I should mention every time Delaware does something significant, it doesn't do anything significant in this case, it's just considered by the others. And so you have these commissioners in Maryland and Virginia agreeing to how the Chesapeake Bay will be regulated, but also saying we really should get the other states that are interested in this general problem to meet together. And they also have recognized Congress can't really do anything because Congress is completely ineffective. The one thing Congress has done lately is tell Pennsylvania they can drive these people off the land in these Connecticut people off their land. But other than that, one person writes to Thomas Jefferson saying that periodically we read about a member of Congress taking a wife, otherwise we'd not know that such a body existed. People aren't attending Congress because the Congress can't do anything. And so that becomes a self-fulfilling prophecy. So at the same time, as I said, Spain closes the Mississippi, and these states of Maryland and Virginia had called for a conference to try to figure out what to do about these various trade problems. And that conference met in September of 1786 at Annapolis in Maryland. 12 commissioners came from 5 states, and they said, well, actually, one of the people came was Alexander Hamilton from New York. He was a member of Congress from New York. And Hamilton, like James Madison of Virginia, had been thinking about these problems of administration, the problem of the fact that Congress cannot have any source of revenue, and that the states aren't giving anything to Congress. And then the question is, why would they give anything to Congress, since Congress doesn't know what to do with what it already has? So you have these big problems, and at the Annapolis conference, they decide we should have a general convention of delegates from all of the states to meet and try to find some way to make the Articles of Confederation work, recognizing that they're not working. So they call for a general meeting that'll happen in the summer of 1787 in Philadelphia. And at the Philadelphia meeting, the Virginians immediately took the lead in that. In fact, the Virginians came in with a plan. James Madison of Virginia had studied the problems of confederations. Thomas Jefferson, who was in Paris, sent Madison all kinds of books he could find on confederations, ancient and modern. And Madison was a great student of history and of politics. That is, how does a political system work? And what motivates people in a political system? Madison had experience in the Virginia legislature. That is, he's not a political theorist. He is very smart. He has studied. In fact, Madison had left Virginia and gone to Princeton, then called the College of New Jersey, and he studied so hard he had a nervous breakdown while in Princeton. There should be a lesson in there for all of us. Then he came back to Virginia, and his father was the wealthiest man in the county, Orange County, Virginia. James Madison was the smartest and best educated guy in Orange County, Virginia. And young James Madison, he was called James Madison Jr., he was barely over 5 feet tall. And he offered himself in about 1772 or 3 as a candidate for the House of Burgesses. Now, at that time, if you were running for political office in Virginia, you would not tell people you were running for political office. Instead, you would indicate that if they did choose you, you would accept the public responsibility of accepting their call. But it would be unseemly for someone like James Madison to go around asking people to vote for him, because that would indicate that he wanted this office. He was greedy for office and advancement. Madison was a gentleman, and that's not something gentlemen did. They didn't go out and solicit votes. They might have friends who may solicit votes, but doing it in a discreet way. And if you are the smartest guy in the county, think about how you're going to go out and appeal to people for votes. You simply present yourself and let them know how smart you are. And what you expect is for them to say, you know what? Young James Madison is the smartest guy in the county. We should send him to be our delegate to the House of Burgesses. And this was James Madison's theory about how he would be a wonderful member of the House of Burgesses, because not only was he the smartest guy in the county, he was one of the smartest people in the state. So who better? What happens, though, is there was a tavern keeper in Orange County, Virginia, who was not a gentleman. And at that time in Virginia, you voted by going to the county seat to cast your ballot. And the candidates might be there simply to present themselves to you, so you might consider them. But there's certainly, James Madison certainly isn't going to say, hey, you should vote for me. The tavern keeper didn't operate under the same set of scruples. Anyone coming in to vote that day got free whiskey. So you go to vote, he's giving you free whiskey. Does anyone know who won that particular election? Who would you have voted for? The smartest guy in the county or the guy dishing out the free whiskey? Jake, your screen just lit up. I think you have a vote here.
Sorry about that. I come in and out every now and then. Well, I like the sound of whiskey. I'll go with the whiskey.
It was a landslide, actually. And if you are James Madison and you lose an election like this, I think you really have two options. One is to say, what a bunch of idiots these people are for not appreciating that I'm the smartest guy in the county. And that's probably what many of us would do. But if you are a political genius, as James Madison is, you think, well, why did I lose? How did I not appeal to people in the right way? And Madison comes to understand how politics works. It's not something for gentlemen. And when he does get to the state legislature, which he does the following session, he understands how it works. It's not ancient Athens where statesmen are standing around philosophizing. It's a place where people are exercising ambition and people are trying to get things either for themselves or their constituents. And he comes to understand what is called the vicious arts of politics. And he doesn't say we shouldn't have vicious arts of politics. He understands this is inherent in human nature, grasping for power and attempting to get things. There are people in politics who are genuinely interested in the public good, but he finds those are pretty few and far between. Most people get into politics for other reasons, and not because they want to advance the public good. They see something that they want to get. This is really an extraordinary development. It's going to lead to one of the extraordinary developments. In fact, as I understand it, the United States has presented to the world three extraordinary gifts, and two of them happen at this particular moment. And James Madison's actually involved in both of these. And one is the creation of a constitutional system, and the other is creating the idea of religious freedom. So I think we're just about out of time tonight, and you'll have to come back next week. We're not having class on Wednesday because it is Veterans Day. So you'll have to be left hanging as to how we get to constitutional government, religious freedom in the United States. Okay, are there any last minute questions, thoughts, contradictory arguments?
This is a question about the...
Can't hear you, Ainsley. You can email me, Ainsley, with a question. Ah, you forgot the question. Okay. That's my kind of question. So, okay. So I'll see you all next week.
Thank you.
Thank you.